show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Estrin. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries. Playing with Matches is a teen novel about Raina, an Orthodox girl who accidentally becomes a secret matchmaker and surprises herself with her success in the business. It's the hippest, funniest Orthodox book I've ever read. I spoke with author Suri Rosen by phone at her home in Toronto. Suri, tell us about Playing with Matches.
Okay, so Playing with Matches is a coming-of-age young adult comedy. It does take place within a traditional Jewish community, and it basically follows the foibles of a 16-year-old girl who is kicked out of her high school in Manhattan and sent to live with a very strict aunt in Toronto. And a chance meeting on a city bus sets off a chain of events that completely spiral out of control, and she becomes an anonymous internet matchmaker. And as she lives this double life, her life completely unravels, sometimes to very comic effect, and sometimes it's also very moving because it's a story of personal growth also on the part of the protagonist.
So this is probably the hippest and funniest Orthodox novel that I've ever read.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. So I wanted to ask, how did you achieve that voice?
Oh, gee, that's so mysterious. Oh, my God, that's such a hard question. I don't know where the voice came from. It's the voice of someone who's formerly very hip in her own school. She's a fashionista, Red Sox fanatic. She's one of the it girls, and she suddenly lost her social agency, and she's a nobody in her new school, but she still has that kind of sarcastic voice, and as the novel progresses, she really deepens and matures as a human being and grows. Where did the voice come from? I don't know.
Well, I wanted to ask, did publishing with a mainstream press possibly make a difference?
Oh, it's actually a long story, calibrating the Jewish content. Originally, when I conceived of it, I actually did think that maybe I would write it for a small niche audience. And as I undertook the writing of a novel, and reality dawned on me of how epic it was to write a novel in terms of structuring it and the amount of revisions and editing that was involved, I realized that if I was going to invest this kind of time, it didn't pay for such a small readership. And then I realized it was just, I couldn't invest that kind of time in a niche audience. So I wrote it for mainstream. And then when I submitted it to agents for representation, I started getting feedback that the Jewish content might be problematic in terms of interesting a publisher. So I actually, as I say to my friends, I de-Jewed it. I actually took out the Jewish content and I submitted it to a publishing company. And it didn't make sense because it lost the context. Because matchmaking is so unheard of and so not mainstream, it didn't make sense. So when I met with my publisher and I mentioned that really probably should be a Jewish book, he said to me, you need to give me the book that it needs to be. So after having de-Jewed it, I re-Jewed it. So then I had to put all that Jewish content back in. The first editor that I worked with wanted it to be very Jewish. So if I mentioned, let's say, the holiday of Purim, she wanted me to explain it or, mention it as us. And then when we sent it to the publisher, his response was, you don't really need that because people can Google what they don't understand. And you don't want to get carried away with that. So there was a lot of fine-tuning and tweaking involved. And so far the reviews have been pretty overwhelming. It's been reviewed by pretty mainstream publications like Kirkus and School Library Journal and also like on Goodreads and Amazon. And people really appreciate that tiny little glimpse that it gives them into the traditional Jewish world, that level of Jewish content. By the response that I'm getting from readers, I tend to think that it hit the right note. That's what I'm hoping anyways.
So what was the inspiration for this story? Have you ever played matchmaker yourself?
I actually did, and it was the most embarrassing story of my entire life. Should I tell you the story?
Yes, please.
This is like a horrible story. Like I cringe as I say it. I was in graduate school 5 years ago in London, Ontario, and I got around by moped. And one time my moped broke down. So the only person I could get was some motorcycle repairman, and the guy showed up, and he was just like really, he was basically hot. Like he was just like a good-looking, really masculine guy. So I was also friends with a single mom in the program, and she was always looking for somebody. she got really close with these two twin professors who were Jewish. She loved them so much. She took whatever course they taught. So she ended up taking like all these Jewish courses, and she wanted all her Jews to meet. So we all had lunch together one time, and I mentioned this like really hot motorcycle repair guy, and oh, wouldn't that be amazing for my friend? So these professors were like, oh, you have to fix her up. You have to fix her up. You have to call him up. So I'm like, okay. So I called him up, and I'm like, I know this is really bizarre. And again, because the whole concept of matchmaking is completely normalized and natural within a traditional Jewish community, and it's completely not in the outside world. And I said, I'm being a bit of a Jewish matchmaker, but I got this amazing friend, and I just thought, if you're available, I would love to fix you up. And he just started laughing. He goes, I'm really flattered, but I'm married with 3 kids.
Oh, no.
I was dying of embarrassment. I was so humiliated. So that was my one matchmaking story, and it was, it was an embarrassing one.
So why did you choose matchmaking as the topic for your book if it had such difficult memories for you?
Well, I came up with the idea before this incident. I was sitting on a couch one Friday night with my daughter, who's a teenager, and I don't know why, the idea just popped into my head. What would happen if there was a girl her age in 11th grade who is a secret matchmaker, and everyone thinks that she's like this legendary matchmaker with matchmaking superpowers, and no one knew that she was like this kid juggling a double life. And from there, I started developing all kinds of scenarios and conflict, because of course story is conflict. I just thought, this idea has so much potential for comedy that I couldn't resist.
And it is a very funny book.
Thank you. Did you enjoy it?
Oh, I really did.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Even the minor characters in this book seemed to be fully realized. And I especially loved Bubby, who's such a troublemaker. She drinks beer, she sneaks salty snacks, she loves baseball. Was she based on anyone you know? No,
she was not. In fact, nobody was based on anyone that I knew, and I think my friends don't believe it. They're just like, come on, and what school was that? And they want details, but it really wasn't. It was just all from my imagination, and they just developed. And I wrote around, 70 drafts of this novel.
Wow.
So through those writing of those drafts, Bubby's character really became more and more fleshed out. In the original version, I actually thought that Rain didn't like her. And everyone kept telling me, no, you don't understand. Rain has to like her. And I'm like, no, are you kidding? They don't get along. They're very similar, and they don't like each other. And everyone kept saying, no, you don't understand. She's likable. And I guess as a novice writer, I didn't recognize what was happening. And as I wrote subsequent drafts, I think I started to understand the characters more. And I have a very soft spot in my heart for Bubby.
Me too.
Thank you.
Sure. So matchmaking is the vehicle for the action, but as you mentioned, an important aspect of Raina's story is her growth as a person and her teshuvah for problems that she's caused in the past. So can you talk about that a bit?
Okay, first of all, I cannot believe you just used the word teshuvah. I'm just blown away that you mentioned that. I'm very impressed. I have to tell you, because in a very, very subtle way, it absolutely is a story of teshuvah. So I'm very gratified that you recognize that, because it's not obvious. It's not a preachy book in any way, but yes, it's a story of teshuvah. In fact, she examines the whole issue of apologizing, which is in some ways very connected to the whole concept of teshuvah. That part of what you do is make amends, is you apologize. And she examines which apologies are more honorable. Mm-hmm. Some apologies are more honorable than others, and some apologies are more self-serving than others. So that, to me, is one of the main aspects of a coming-of-age novel, is that growth and that deepening and the whole process of making amends. As a matter of fact, when I was offered the contract from the publisher, they asked me to do a series, and I actually said no. I was very reluctant to do a series, because so much of what makes this novel meaningful is the whole idea of her growth and the teshuvah process. So once you have that in the first book, where do you go from there in a series? It's never going to be satisfying. The only thing that I can say is that if this book, by any reason, was a bestseller, the one thing that I would love to do would be a sequel, where we deal more with Rain herself, where we know where she ends up in life.
Right. I could see that.
And the other thing is that Rain herself, her coming of age and her maturing and deepening in teshuvah do not have to do with some guy falling in love with her, the hottie in the school. And I'm a little blown away that so many people are commenting that they love that, because she's growing because of her own experiences, of her own making.
Mm-hmm. You recently participated in Dear Teen Me,
the project where authors write letters to their teenage selves. So,
how'd you find it?
I don't remember how I found it. I must have Googled you.
Oh, okay.
So, as the author of a book for and about teens, this seems very apropos. So, I wanted to ask you what that exercise was like. And if you could really speak to your teenage self, would you suggest that she do anything differently?
Actually, I struggled tremendously with that Dear Teen Me. In the end, I was really, really happy with what came out of it. But when I went through the other posts on that website, I found that there was a lot of trauma in people's past. And I didn't really want to explore trauma. I talked more about what gave me hope. Because, basically, who likes their teenage years? No one does, really. It was a pretty miserable time for me, but I didn't really want to focus on what was horrible. My miracle came from my orthodontist. I had to go get my braces adjusted every month, and I would swipe a stack of appointment cards, and I would sign myself out. And it was great, because I was in a school where I was there for 9 hours every day. It was a double curriculum. It was really intense. And then I'd go home with 6 hours of homework, and I had to stop playing the flute, and I was doing a lot of arts and music on the side. And it was not a great situation for me. So because of these orthodontist appointment cards, I guess it never occurred to them that I was going to orthodontist like 5 times a week. But I would sign myself out on a regular basis, and I essentially became a part-time student in a school that did not have part-time students. Like, no one noticed. So I was constantly going downtown, and I was going to bookstores and art bookstores and exploring the arts. And it was just a really wonderful experience for me. And if I could go back and I could do things over again, I let the writing fall by the wayside. And ultimately, that's what called out to me over the years, and I wish that I wouldn't have waited this long to get back to it. So I'm like the hindsight fairy. So the hindsight fairy would go back and say, you know what, don't give up the writing, because ultimately that's really the most important thing to you.
Yeah. So, Suri Rosen, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
It was.
Well, you're a very good interviewer, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast, follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod, email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com, or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida, at cbiboca.org, and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.